Good morning, everyone. Afternoon, I guess. Thank you all for being here today. Before we get started, I just want to briefly remind everyone that we have happy hour on Thursday, so please come as a department. It would be great to see you all there. And then also, location to be announced. We're not sure yet. And also next week will be the second part, I guess, of the graduate student centennial colloquium responses, so we hope you all can make that as well. I'd like to begin today by thanking the Center for Ancient Studies for their gracious co-sponsorship in helping us to bring Dr. Alfredo Gonzalez-Ruibal here from the Spanish National Research Council. He's there with the Institute for Heritage Studies and has been doing some rather amazing work, if I may say so myself. It's really a pleasure to have him here. He's doing some archaeology of the contemporary past. So his focus has been mostly on the 20th and 21st century, at least in his recent work, with work on the Spanish Civil War being a large part of that, but as well as a major commitment to archaeology as a methodology and to materiality as a means of knowing things, which I've found particularly powerful. His recent works have included the archaeology of resistance, materiality in time in an African borderland, and 2 edited volumes, Ethics in the Archaeology of Violence, and Reclaiming Archaeology Beyond the Tropes of Modernity. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Alfredo Gonzalez-Ruibal.
First of all, I would like to thank the university and Tiffany in particular for the invitation to talk here. Can you hear me? Is it okay? Should I speak a little bit louder? No?
A little louder.
A little louder? Yeah. I'm really happy to be here, among other things, because this gives me the opportunity to talk about work in progress. I'm going to present what should be one of the chapters of a book I'm working on, the archaeology of supermodernity, or the archaeology of high modernity or late modernity, whatever you want to put it. One of the central elements in this book is the concept of time, and in particular the idea of time related to modernity and late modernity. Time is, of course, very important in the case of in archaeology. It doesn't matter if you're working with prehistoric archaeology, historical archaeology, or the archaeology of the contemporary past. But in the case of the archaeology of the contemporary past, or the archaeology, I would say, of recent periods, I understand for recent periods, the last 500 years or so, as opposed to prehistoric archaeology, is particularly difficult for different reasons. For epistemological reasons, for, let's say, sociological reasons, if we want to put it like that, and for ethical reasons as well. So I would like to unpack a little bit these 3 problems, these 3 difficulties of the time of modernity here with some archaeological examples, or with some examples where material culture plays a very important role. So these 3 questions, these 3 problems with the time of modernity, as I say, have to do with epistemological issues, sociological, historical issues, and ethical issues. Regarding the first problem, the issue of knowledge, the question is, how can we produce relevant knowledge of the recent past? That is, how can we produce knowledge that is really important, provided, taking into account that when we are dealing with recent times, we have a lot of sources, we have written documents, we have eyewitnesses in the case of the last 100 years or so, we have visual information in the form of paintings or photographs and so on. So how can we do something from an archaeological point of view that is really interesting and relevant? And when I'm saying relevant, I'm not thinking just in archaeology, but relevant for the social sciences in general, relevant for sociology, for history, for anthropology. second problem has to do with the specific time, the specific temporality of supermodernity, or late modernity if you want. The problem with the time of modernity, especially the last 100 years or so, is that it is unique in many ways. It is very different from other temporalities, from other historical temporalities. And one of the main differences has to do with the acceleration of time. This is something that is well known through the work of geographers and historians and anthropologists. So there is nothing new here. But this does not mean that it is not a problem for archaeologists, because we are not used to deal with these fast temporalities of modernity, especially late modernity. These on the one hand, but on the other hand, the temporality of modernity, the temporality of supermodernity, it is not just all about acceleration. It is also about multi-layer temporalities. It is also about a very complex kind of temporality where you have slow times and fast times together. And sometimes we tend to forget slow time and to privilege the accelerated temporalities over the others. And finally, we have the problems related to ethics, to our ethical commitment to the victims of history in the time of modernity. And here there is a paradox, because on the one hand, we have to admit that there are problems, there are ethical problems when you are dealing with recent sites, with recent heritage, with recent things that you don't have when you are dealing with a Paleolithic site, for example. There are specific ethical issues that affect the archaeology of the contemporary past, also historical archaeology. But at the same time, if there is something that we have learned about ethics during the last 30 years or so, is that we cannot respect this conventional divide between the present and the past, the deep past and the recent past anymore, because there are different temporalities that challenge from an ethical point of view and from a political point of view this divide, this stark divide between past and present. And you have of course the case of the time, ancestral time, in the case of indigenous communities all over the world. It is the case of Native Americans in the United States. So on the one hand, we have these new ethical commitments that are associated to recent sites, to the archaeology of the contemporary past, but at the same time we have to accept that the deep past is continuously breaking into the present. So we have to tackle these double ethical problem. So I would like to start with the epistemological issues, with the problem of producing relevant knowledge of the recent past. The main problem that we have as archaeologists, historical archaeologists or archaeologists of the contemporary past, is that we tend to respect perhaps too much the time of historiography, that is, the time produced by historians based on texts, on written sources and written documents. I would say that the problem is not that just that we are respecting too much the time of historiography, but that we are respecting too much a specific time frame, a specific regime of historicity, which is the regime of historicism, a very specific way of thinking about history in very unilinear evolutionary terms. But there are other ways of thinking about history that can be more interesting for archaeologists, that can be more useful for archaeologists. So if we want to produce knowledge that is really relevant about recent times, what we have to do is to follow our own time. We have to follow archaeological time. And this archaeological time is, of course, the time of things. So as archaeologists, we should start our narratives from things rather than from the narratives that are produced by historians. And when I'm saying that, I don't mean that the time of archaeology should be better in any way to the time of history. It is simply that if we want to do something, if we want to write narratives that are really powerful from the point of view of archaeology, we have to find our own way of producing these narratives, and we have to focus on things to produce these narratives. So, but as I was saying, we are not alone in this. There are many historians that have been working on alternative ways of tackling the time. And this is the case of the analysis school, of course, since the 1920s. And we have the case of Ferdinand Braudel, of course, who is the most famous of the analysis historians, probably. But there are many other historians, and one of them is Jacques Le Goff, another French historian who has been problematizing time for the last 50 years or so. He died last year. One of his last books, the title of one of his last books was something like, translated into English would be something like, Do We Have to Cut History in Slices? And what he was proposing was that we have to think outside conventional time frames. We have to think outside the conventional model of the Middle Ages, the Renaissance, modernity, and so on. And he uses the example of the Middle Ages that he knew particularly well. And he proposes that instead of thinking of the Middle Ages as finishing in the late or middle 15th century, he proposes that we should think of the Middle Ages ending in the 1800s. But if we want to do that, in fact, he's still cutting history in slices, but what he's doing is proposing different kind of slices. That is not the historicist slices we are used to, but new kinds of periodizations that are based on different sources. So this is what we archaeologists should be doing when we are dealing with recent times. We should suggest, we should propose our own time frames, our own historical slices if we decide to cut history at all. And I think that this image represents very well what Jacques Le Goff wants to say. So this is a photograph of a group of East European peasants that are escaping from the advance of the German army in 1941. But if it weren't a photograph, and if it weren't dated in 1941, we would have a really hard time putting a date to this photograph. Because all the social world that we are seeing here, all the material world that we are seeing here, all the technology is of course from 1941, but it could be also from 1641 or 1541. So this photograph is particularly interesting also because what forces us to think time in a different way, to think periodizations in a different way, in this case, is basically material culture. So we follow the time of things here. We have to cut history in different slices. The problem is that it is not just that many historians follow this historicist regime of historicity. It is also that we archaeologists, we tend to think of time in a very homogeneous, synchronous way. So we tend to make time look very coherent. And the problem is that time is not necessarily coherent. If we are asked, for example, to provide a snapshot of the material culture, of the pottery of the Western Roman Empire in the 4th century AD, we produce an image like this one with these typical pots that were being used in the 4th century AD. But the problem is that there were many other pots that were being used during the 4th century AD that were older, but we tend to forget about that because it's not useful. When we want to date sites, we want artifacts that are synchronous with periods, so to say. So we tend to purify the past, and we tend to produce these very homogeneous, synchronous images of historical periods. But if we look at the time of things, and if we are not so much concerned with producing these very homogeneous temporalities, we might find interesting things, and we might find things that are not necessarily inherent to the conventional historical narratives. And we have the example provided by Laurent Olivier in his wonderful book, The Dark Abyss of Time, that was translated into English in 2010, I think. And there he talks about typological time and chronological time, which is more or less the same as the time of things and the time of historiography. And he says that this time of things, this typological time and the chronological time do not always go in sync. Sometimes typological time goes very fast and chronological time doesn't go that fast, and sometimes it's the other way around. And he uses the example of miners' lamps. He discovered that there is a lot of innovation and change during the 1850s in mining lamps. So at that time, typological time, or the time of things, was ahead of its time. So mining lamps were more complex, more sophisticated, and they changed more rapidly than other technologies and other social issues at the time. But after the 1890s, these mining lamps seem to be stuck in time. They don't evolve anymore, and they remain the same until the late 1960s, when they disappear forever. And this coincides with a period of history that is hyper-eventful. So a period in history where millions of things are happening, where technology is advancing and is changing very much. So this is a good example of this decoupling between the time of historiography, the time of history, and the time of things. But perhaps one of the best examples to deconstruct the time of history, or the time of historicism, rather, is vernacular architecture, traditional architecture. Traditional architecture is usually described either as achronic or as anachronic. If you think that vernacular architecture is achronic, that means that vernacular architecture has no specific time. So it looks like eternal. It belongs to any period in history. And if you look at vernacular architecture from this point of view, you are probably a romantic or a nationalist. So you tend to see vernacular architecture as the essence of a people or a nation or a region. Whereas if you look at vernacular architecture as anachronic, you think that it is out of time, that it is misplaced. It does not belong to this specific period. It is like this pigsty from the mid-20th century in Spain. When this pigsty was built, there were already airports in Spain and highways and all that. So it looks out of time. It seems that it does not belong to this time. Among other things, because the kind of architecture, the kind of technology that was used to make this pigsty is Neolithic in many ways. Many of the techniques were already used 5,000 years ago. The problem is that this is as much a building from the mid-20th century as a skyscraper or a factory. So we have to consider that time is complex, and that we cannot homogenize time, and we have to get used to the fact that things that look from different times actually belong to the same period. Now, the problem is that even for archaeologists, it's something that is difficult to do, because I'll think, for example, of the ruins of modernity, the ruins of the 20th century, of the 21st century. If you are asked about the archaeology of the 20th century or 21st century, about the ruins of the present, I'm sure that the kind of image that comes to your mind is probably a ruin factory or something like that. This is from Detroit. So it's a ruin of glass and concrete and steel. But this is not necessarily the best example of a ruin of modernity. I would say that it is actually a very bad example of a ruin of the 20th century. This is a much better example of a ruin of the 20th century. Ruin of a vernacular building, ruins of stone and thatch and mud and clay and bamboo. So these are the ruins that make the archaeological record of the 20th and the 21st century. And why I'm saying that? Well, basically because what is disappearing, what has been disappearing during the last 100 years or so, is vernacular architecture. It is not factories. We're still building factories. And of course there is a problem with deindustrialization in places like the United States or Europe, but even in these places, we are still building factories. There are many more vernacular buildings that are being abandoned than factories and skyscrapers and high-rises and modern buildings. Modern in the sense of belonging to the modern rationality of modern technology. So this is a much better example of the archaeology of the 20th century, of the 21st century. And if an archaeologist would be studying the archaeology of the 20th century in 1,000 years, he would find many more ruins belonging to this kind of architecture than to the super modern architecture of factories and airports and so on. On the other hand, we tend to forget that, especially at least those of us who live in Europe or North America, we tend to forget that there are still many people whose material environment looks much more like this than the concrete building I showed you before. So the idea to call attention to these things, to these different materialities, is not just anecdotal. It is not just that I want you to value things, traditional things like stone and mud or wood. The thing is that if we forget about these things, we are forgetting about the people that make these things, that build these buildings. So we are forgetting about 70% of the humankind. And in some cases also, it is not just that vernacular architecture belongs to the present, which is something that we tend to forget, but it is also that in some cases and in some places, vernacular architecture is replacing modern architecture, what we understand by modern architecture. And this is the case with many countries that had communist regimes during the 1970s or 1980s, such as Ethiopia. And after these regimes collapsed, it was a revival of all the forms of architecture and other forms of society. And this is the case, I don't know if you can see it very well, but you can see here the remains of a collective farm made with a corrugated metal sheet. And then you have a couple, this is abandoned, and there you can see a couple of huts made of bamboo and thatch that are still being used. They were built after the collapse of the communist regime. Following the time of things and respecting the complexity of the time of things has also political consequences. It is not just an epistemological issue. It is an epistemological issue with far-reaching political consequences. And this is something that affects, for example, our ideas of heritage. If you consider that you have to make time homogeneous and coherent, then you would probably think that you have to expel Nubians who are living or have been living amidst pharaonic ruins for the last 1,000 years because they do not belong, because they are mixing times. They are mixing the time of antiquity and the time of tradition, if you want. And this is something that simply does not work if you have this historicist perspective. So you would probably want to resettle these people outside the pharaonic site in a modern settlement. And this is what the Egyptian authorities have been doing with the Nubians from the village of Gurma. But there are other kinds of political consequences that are more related to epistemology. And I would like to illustrate these political consequences of the time of things with an example from the Spanish Civil War, on which I've been working for the last 7 or 8 years. The Spanish Civil War started in 1936 after a failed coup d'etat by a group of fascist and conservative generals. So this started the war that lasted until 1939, and after 1939 a dictatorship was established that ended only in 1975. This group of fascist generals decided shortly after starting the war that they had to change history. So they have to try to convince people that it wasn't them who had started the war, but rather the regime, the Republican regime, the democratic system that existed before the coup. So for doing that, they had to do a little bit of historiographical engineering, and they decided that the Spanish Civil War had started in 1934, that is 2 years before the actual beginning of the war, and it had started, according to these generals and their historians, with an insurrection of leftist parties and unions and so on that took place in northern Spain in October 1934. This insurrection was destroyed quite easily, so it didn't actually lead to a war, but the idea was there. So the war started in 1934, and it wasn't us, it was them who started it. So there are many revisionist historians today. They are associated with the extreme right that espouse these theories, and they still think, and they try to convince people that the Spanish Civil War was actually started by the democratic regime in 1934, or by leftist parties that were associated to this democratic regime. So what does archaeology say? What does the time of things says in this case? Well, it tells a different tale indeed. If we look at things, we see that there is an assemblage that is being formed, that is being composed after 1936, that it didn't exist before 1936. It didn't exist in 1934 or 1935. And this basically consists in thinking as archaeologists. When we try to create periodizations in archaeology, what we do is to select different kinds of things that change. So we look at complete assemblages. It is not enough with looking at a specific kind of lithic artifact, or a hairpin, or an axe, or a house. So we need that everything changes, or mostly everything changes at the same time, or a large part of the material cultures changes at the same time. So when it is swords and spears and pots and houses and settlement patterns and landscape that changes, then we can say that this is no longer the Bronze Age, this is the Iron Age, for example, right? So we can do the same thing with the 20th century or the 21st century or the 19th century. We can look at material assemblages and see how they change. And there is no change between 1931, when the Second Spanish Republic was established, and 1936. When we see a real change in the assemblage, when we see a real change in the archaeological record, it is in 1936. It is then when we see that the entire landscape is transformed with trenches around the front line in Spain in 1936, 1937. It was 1,200 miles. So it was 2.5 times longer than the Western Front during the First World War. We have pillboxes, military fortifications, we have camps, we have concentration camps and prisons that are built all over the country, and we have mass graves. Mass graves with people that have been executed because of their political ideas. I'm going to show you now an image of one of the mass graves. I just wanted to tell you beforehand. We have around 10,000 mass graves in Spain, with around 150,000 people that were killed between 1936 and 1952. That is well after the end of the war. Around 13 years after the end of the war, there were still people that were being killed and thrown into unmarked clandestine burials. So what does this tell us? This tells us that if we follow the time of things, we will probably get a democratic narrative, a democratic historical narrative. Whereas if we follow a specific version of the time of words, of the time of documents, as proposed by revisionist historians, we will probably get a history that is, if not outright fascist, it is at least exonerates dictatorship. So this is why I say that following the time of things does not have just epistemological consequences, but also political consequences. The second problem, when we are working with the time of late modernity, time of supermodernity, has to do with the specific temporalities of supermodernity. And these specific temporalities of supermodernity, they are usually described as accelerated temporalities, as time that goes really fast. It is the abolition of time and space and so on, something in which philosophers and geographers and anthropologists have been insisting, actually, since the late 19th century. So on the one hand, what we archaeologists can do is try to appraise this acceleration of time from an archaeological point of view. What is the relationship between this accelerated time and materiality? What is the relationship between the acceleration of time and the destruction of landscape, the destruction of societies, communities, and so on? But at the same time, we shouldn't forget that along with this acceleration of time, there is also a complexity of temporalities that still exist. There is a tendency in modernity to annihilate alternative forms of temporality, but the thing is that they still exist. And we can find them in unexpected places, as I will try to show you. So along with this accelerated time and accelerated technologies and so on, we have slow communities, we have slow things, and we have slow places. So perhaps one of the first things that we have to ask ourselves when we speak about accelerated time, about the speed of our society and globalization and so on, is acceleration, but for whom? Who is actually going faster? Is this something democratic? Is this something that affects everybody in the world, every social group? And in which way is this acceleration being produced? And also, what is the speed of society? What is the speed of technology? It is a homogeneous kind of a speed. Is everybody and everything going faster and faster, or are there different rhythms, different velocities? So when we think, for example, about travel, which is something that is all over the place now in cultural geography, for example, but also in archaeology, there is now a lot of books about mobility and so on. We tend to think about, well, airplanes, right? As if everybody was moving around in airplanes. But this is not necessarily the case. We only have to think about the many immigrants all over the world that are using alternative means of transportation. They are walking, they are using buses or trucks or bicycles or horses to move from the south to the north. You have, of course, here the case of the illegal immigrants from Central America and Mexico trying to get into the United States. Looking at these different kinds of velocity, these different kinds of speed from an archaeological point of view means looking at different rhythms of sedimentation. These slower temporalities go hand in hand with thicker sedimentation. So it is easier to follow the track of illegal immigrants than it is to follow the track of businessmen or scholars, for that matter. Because my trip, for example, from Madrid to Philadelphia left no archaeological trace, or at least no archaeological trace that can be assigned to my person in any way. Whereas when you look at the immigrants that are crossing the United States, you can identify the biographies of these people. So in a way, archaeology can do here something like a sort of political justice to these slower temporalities. It can recover these experiences of subaltern peoples and subaltern temporalities. If there is something that is democratic, however, is fast destruction. Of course, fast destruction has always existed because there have always been earthquakes and volcanoes and things like that. But something that is more characteristic of supermodernity is the association of fast destruction and fast reconstruction. And there is a very interesting concept that has been proposed by Shannon Lidode from the University of Chicago, which is the concept of social taphonomy. She proposes to look at these processes of destruction, reconstruction, demolition, displacement of populations and so on as taphonomy. But a taphonomy that is social in essence. So what we are learning about these taphonomic processes, it is not just the combination of cultural and natural elements that help produce the archaeological record, but it is also an image of our society as it works, as it is. Another way in which we can understand the acceleration of time, the acceleration of supermodern time is in landscape. It's perhaps here where we can really appraise this fast temporality of globalization and advanced capitalism and so on. And the rate of destruction and modification of landscape of the last 100 years or 200 years is really unique in history. And this is something that was already noticed by Claude Lévi-Strauss when he went to Brazil in 1934. He came from France with his old agricultural landscapes that developed slowly from the Neolithic onwards, and then he was confronted with the landscapes of the New World, and especially the landscapes of South America, and he saw the accelerated rate of destruction of these landscapes by business, by the agribusiness and capitalism and so on. And he compared these two landscapes, the landscapes of the Old World that developed very slowly and the landscapes of Brazil that were developing in just a few decades. They have changed as much as the entire landscape of Europe in several millennia. And this is something that you can see still today in places like Brazil, of course, but also Paraguay. This transformation of landscape, it is not just the material transformation of landscape, but of course the livelihood of the people that live here. This image, I took it almost 10 years ago. This is now pasture, but it used to be a rainforest just 15 years before I arrived to this area. And there were hunter-gatherers living in this rainforest, and there were wild animals, so it was a completely different world, and everything was destroyed in 10, 15 years. So this is quite unique of modernity. You don't have this fast rate of destruction and transformation of the landscape in other periods, except with some exceptions. This large landscape transformation is something that you can see also in the case of borders, for example. The materialization of borders, the larger scale materialization of borderland landscapes is again very specific of supermodernity. And again, war is one of the main motors of the transformation of landscape all over the world. And it has been pointed out several times for the case of the First World War, how the pastoral landscapes of Northern Europe were suddenly transformed in just 4 years into industrial meat grinders where millions of people died, and forests and fields were transformed in lunar landscapes. But I would say that the case of the war landscapes of Spain are perhaps better examples, because the scale was much greater, but also because this was the Spanish societies during the 1930s were much more traditional than the communities of Northern Europe. So this was in many ways a very medieval landscape that was transformed for good. And it was transformed in a very durable way, in the sense that these landscapes were not, the trenches were not backfilled, many of the fields were not cultivated again, so you can still go there, you can still see all the trenches and all the destruction of the craters and so on, all over the place. And this transformation of the landscape is also very durable for other reasons that are very specific of late modernity, and one of the main reasons is high explosive. So these landscapes, these war landscapes, they are still very active landscapes. They are not passive landscapes. They are still landscapes that are lethal, that can kill. Other examples of the acceleration of supermodernity are the cycles of boom and bust of capitalism, and this is something that you can see better in the case of South America, because there you have periods of great economic growth for 10, 20, 30 years. The economies develop a lot. People, at least some people, become very rich, and the landscape is transformed accordingly. And after that, the economies collapse because the rubber is worthless after a certain point, because there is too much coffee that is being produced. And then what we have are landscapes of abandonment, landscapes of destruction, great social disruption. And so this is an example of the salpeter mines of northern Chile. There was a period of great economic growth between 1880 and 1930, and after that this desert became a desert again, with no people, no wealth. Another thing in which historians insist very much is the idea of hyper-eventfulness, the idea that historical time accelerates. There are more things that are happening now that used to happen in the 10th century AD, for example, or 5,000 years ago. So there are more and more events. And we can study this also archaeologically, because this hyper-eventfulness leaves a lot of archaeological traces behind. And you have only to think about two very important phenomena that changed the world in the 20th century, late 19th century and 20th century. One of them is imperialism. Imperialism was really short-lived. It started in 1885, more or less, and in the early 1960s was basically liquidated. But during these 70 or so years, the entire world changed, and these changes are still visible today. They still determine the lives of millions of people all over the world. From an archaeological point of view, you can see this short event very well in the many colonial ruins that you can find in places like, in regions like Africa or Southeast Asia. The other good example is communism, real socialism, if you want it, which lasted around 80 years more or less, depending on the places. There are still some countries that are communist, but communism as such, as a global political system, actually ended like 20 or so years ago. And again, it was very short-lived, but it produced an enormous amount of ruins, an enormous amount of infrastructures and material worlds, material experiences that were left to decay after 1991. So there are a lot of things that we can study as archaeologists in relation to this acceleration of time, this acceleration of historical events. But we should also look at slow temporalities, these other experiences of time that still exist in our world, in our globalized world. Well, there are slow communities, you know about that. Even in the United States, there are still some groups that do not follow the rules of the accelerated time of late capitalism. But from an archaeological point of view, perhaps what is more interesting to us is the existence of slow things. And a good example of a slow thing is the bow and the arrows. This is Camara, who is an Aguara Indian from northeastern Brazil. He lives in the rainforest, and he still hunts for a living. And he uses these bow and arrows. I think this image is interesting because Camara is, of course, wearing a t-shirt and a necklace made with small plastic beads. Probably, if I were a cultural anthropologist, I would be more interested in the t-shirt because this speaks about globalization, about NGOs, about the state, about missions, about cultural change, about traditional societies adapting or negotiating their incorporation into the wider world. These are, of course, very interesting things, but as an archaeologist, I'm more interested in the bow and the arrows. I think that it is amazing that this Camara is still using a technology that is 10,000 years old, or over 10,000 years old. And he's not using this technology because he's showing off, because I'm taking a photograph, or because he thinks this is part of his cultural heritage or anything like that. He's using a bow and arrows because he's hunting monkeys, and because he eats monkeys, and because this is the only way he knows he can get monkeys. So this, for me, is a real feat that he has managed to maintain, to keep this technology for such a long time, and that this slow technology, this old technology, can still be used, can still be something practical, that can be put to practical uses. And of course you can tell me that I'm creating a divide here between these traditional non-modern peoples that use slow technology versus us who use modern technologies that change very much and that are very fast. And in a sense I would say yes, quite unashamedly. I think that these slow communities use slow artifacts, and I don't think that there is anything wrong with that, because I don't think that the acceleration of time and the acceleration of technology is necessarily good or makes you a better human being or more intelligent or anything. But at the same time, I would say that there are many slow things in our own society that we tend to overlook. And I think we should pay more attention to these slow things to understand better this heterotemporality, this complex multi-layered temporality of supermodernity. And sometimes we can find these slow things in the least places we would expect to find them. This is the case, for example, of assault rifles. The American Army is using, the soldiers are using assault rifle that was designed originally in 1957, the R-15, which is the basis of the modern M4 rifle. So it is already 60 years old, but we tend to focus on drones and you know, all the elements that look really modern and advanced in modern armies, and we tend to forget the basic elements, the basic tools that are being still used by soldiers to kill or to wound the enemy. The other thing are airplanes. We tend to think of airplanes as the most advanced and ever-changing technology, but it is not exactly true. Most of the most important breakthroughs in aviation occurred immediately after the Second World War, and most of the planes we are using today are from the 1960s, in essence. So there are changes, of course, I wouldn't deny that, but the thing is that the basic engineering of airplanes has not changed that much for the last 60 years or so. And in fact, there are some specific airplanes, such as the Boeing 737, which is the most widely used jet aircraft today, that dates to 1967. So even specific models do not change that much. So I think that archaeology should look also at these technologies that look very modern but are not that modern, because I think that as archaeologists we are perhaps better, we are more used to deal with these things that have very long biographies that do not change that much, that are rooted very much in the past. And then we have the problem with the slow places. And I say that we have a problem with the slow places because some of the best examples that I can think of, at least, of slow places are associated to totalitarian regimes. Totalitarian regimes, dictatorships, they tend to produce very heavy infrastructures, very heavy architectures, architectures to last, and not just to last, but also to shape. Thank you. This subjectivity of people, the way people think, the way the people behave. And these infrastructures, they don't change that easily. So if you go to northern Russia, for example, to a town like Nikel in this case, you will find that 99% of the built environment belongs to the communist period. So all the statues, all the monuments, all the infrastructure, all the buildings, all the social housing was built in the 1940s, 1950s, 1960s. So in a sense, these slow places, what they do is they force people to live in another period, which is not necessarily bad, except for the fact that this other period was a dictatorship. It was a totalitarian regime. And I think that we cannot understand many things that are going on in places like Russia, but also in Spain, if you don't understand the power of things, the power of these places to slow down society, to slow down the mentality of people. And this brings me to the last issue that I will talk about here, the time of ethics, the problem with ethics in supermodernity in recent times. And I would like to talk only about two issues that I think are specific of supermodernity, or specific, particularly difficult of modern times. And one of them is the political obliteration of time. People have been killed for political reasons for hundreds of thousands of years. There is nothing particularly original about the assassination of political rivals. What is perhaps more specific of our times is the complete annihilation of time, of the time of your political enemies. So if we assassinate people, if we kill people, we kill the present and the future of this person. But if we make the bodies or the things of your enemies disappear, then you're also killing the past of these people. And when you're killing the past, the present and the future, what you're doing is annihilating time. And this is what the Serbs did, for example, in the case of Yugoslavia. Well, not only the Serbs, but perhaps the destruction of the Bosnian heritage is perhaps the most famous of these politics of destruction of time. It's also the case with mass graves. The idea of a mass grave is not just a place where you put bodies of the people that you have killed. It is also a technology that is used to make people disappear forever. This is why these graves are clandestine, they are not marked. So the idea is to destroy, to annihilate the memory of these people. So here archaeologists have, from an ethical point of view, we have two issues, two problems that we have to deal with. On the one hand, we have to recover the memory of these people. We have to recover, of course we cannot recover the life of these people, but we have to prove, it is our ethical responsibility to prove that these people had existed. It doesn't matter if it is people killed by the communist regime, by a fascist dictatorship, the Jews assassinated during the Nazi genocide. We have to prove that these people existed. We have to retrieve their time, to put it in a way. But at the same time, we face the challenge also of proving that there has been an attempt to erase all traces of this destruction. That is, we have to prove archaeologically that the killers had made the disappear, as they say in Argentina. And this is something that archaeology can actually do. For example, in the concentration camp, the extermination camp of Sobibor, archaeologists have been able not just to prove that there were gas chambers there, but they have also been able to prove that these gas chambers had been dismantled and the entire place had been destroyed purposefully to erase all traces of the genocide. And this is something that my team and I also did in the case of Spain. We excavated the site of a concentration camp that was in use in 1939 and 1940. And there is nothing that you can see on the surface now. It is very difficult to see anything that could be related to a concentration camp. But when we excavated, we discovered the traces, not just of the concentration camp, not just of this technology for making people disappear, for killing people, for torturing people, but we also found traces of the dismantling, of the attempt at making this site disappear forever. And finally, the last thing I would like to talk about is from an ethical point of view, is the coincidence today between the time of jurisdiction and the time of archaeology. In both cases, in the case of law and in the case of archaeology, we are witnessing abolition of temporal limits. In the case of the time of jurisdiction, the time of law, after 1945-46, with the Nuremberg trials, lawyers and judges decided that there could be no limit, no statute of limitation for certain crimes, for the crimes against humanity. So it doesn't mind if this crime was carried out in 1945 or 2,000 years ago. You can prosecute this crime, even if it's only from a symbolical point of view, because the criminals are already dead. But you can start criminal procedures for these. And this is similar to what is happening today in archaeology too. We realize that we cannot create divides between past and present as we used to. That the past is here with us in the present. That the past is always interrupting the present in many ways. And this is important from an ethical point of view, because this means that our responsibility is not just to live in communities, but also to the communities of the past, because the communities of the past and the communities of the present, in many ways, and in many cases, they form a single community. And you can see that, well, I'm going to skip these. And you can see that in many different cases. Some cases are more problematic than others. You can see this in the case of many nationalist movements all over the world. For many nationalists, there are no temporal divide between past and present. These are the ruins of the city of Barcelona that was bombed at the beginning of the 18th century. And this place was excavated during the last 10 years. And for many Catalonians that are nationalists, this is still an open wound. This is still a symbol of how Spain has continuously attacked Catalonia, has continuously tried to oppress the Catalonian people. So for them, this past is very much the present. So this is complicated from an ethical point of view for the archaeologists that are dealing with this legacy. But we also have the case of ancestral time that I commented at the beginning. How do we deal with this ancestral time that does not respect the unilinear time of modernity that we are used to? How do we deal with this time that is for us very old, but at the same time very present? And finally, we're going to speak about the Messianic time of politics. And this, again, is very well represented in the case of Spain, with the exhumation of masquerades from 1936 onwards. What this phenomenon is doing is, again, breaking the boundaries between past and present. The politics of the 1930s are suddenly very present now, today, and they are shaping the political environment in Spain. So again, archaeologists are involved in these. They're involved in the time of nationalism, in the ancestral time of indigenous communities, and the messianic time of political communities. And this creates different kinds of commitments and different kinds of ethical challenges. So to conclude, the main three ideas is that if we want to produce an archaeology test that is really relevant for the last, let's say, 500 years, we have to follow the time of things. We have to follow the time of things always, but it is specifically important to do that in the case of modernity and late modernity, because if we do not do that, our knowledge, the knowledge that we produce, will run the risk of being irrelevant. And this is a problem that prehistorians do not have, because prehistoric knowledge is immediately relevant. Second, we have to understand the heterotemporality of modernity, the complexity of times that compose the time of modernity, slow time and also fast time, and the material effects of fast accelerated time. And finally, we have to honor the commitment with the victims of history. And this means respect the victims of history irrespective of the time of these victims, because this divide between past and present no longer holds. Thank you.
Open up for questions. Okay, well, I'll start us off. So thank you very much. A lot of your work has dealt with this issue of time, and that's been a really interesting engagement for me. And one of the things that I'm wondering about is, as you think through the time of things, how are you dealing with the relationship that is normally constructed between time and space? And so how are we thinking about the spatiotemporal and the sort of context of time, context being so important in archaeology, and you know, what sort of things traverse or transgress the boundaries of context, and what sorts of things can we think about that push sort of a, I hesitate to say universal, but you know, a sort of grander theorizing or philosophy of time beyond the spatial borders, if that exists or if not.
Well, I think that the issue of space is very much, of course, related to the issue of time, and the element that is perhaps common in both cases, in the case of modernity or late modernity, is the idea of excess. So in the case of time, there is an excess of time that is represented by the acceleration of time, hyper-eventfulness and all that. And in the case of space, the excess, I think, is the production of leftover spaces, of marginal spaces, of spaces that are redundant, that are also forgotten, that are crossed out of our memories, of our daily experiences. I would say that things like, or spaces like ghettos, for example, would feel very much these effects of the spatial excess of supermodernity. Again, like in the case of time, we have to think about this excess of a space, but we also have to think about the lack of space, about the equivalent to slow places or slow technologies, and in this case it would be restricted spaces like refugee camps, or like prisons, or like hospitals, these kind of places, like what Foucault would call heterotopias, like the heterotopias in this case of globalization and modernity. So I think that there is a reflection to be done also on space that can be very productive from an archaeological point of view. What is the materiality of these supermodern spatiality, what is the materiality of these leftover spaces, these wastelands, for example.
So, really very interesting talk. I'm curious about the heterogeneous nature of time from the point of view of what sort of, forces might be at work when one thinks about something like the persistence of slow time in certain areas. Is it just inertia? What is it that's responsible for the kind of heterogeneity we're looking at? Have you given thought to that, and can you talk about it a little?
Yeah, well, I guess there are all kinds of reasons for the production of these pockets of slow time, and some of them I would say that they are of a physical, geographical nature. And I remember here the case of what Ferdinand Brodel said about mountains, that mountains reject big history. So there are specific spaces that are very appropriate to produce these slow temporalities, of course. Isolation, physical isolation certainly helps. But then there is also the political economy of slow time. So if you want to go fast, you need a strong economy for that. You need a powerful economy behind. So these slow and fast times are usually related to economic opportunities, for example, or how powerful your nation is, or how many efforts your nation is doing to accelerate time in a specific place. And then you have also ideology, like in the case of communism, there is this ideology of progress that forced nations to change very fast, and it doesn't matter if you were living in Tanzania or in Russia, the idea was to make things fast. And this of course affected technology and landscape and materiality in general. So I would say that there are many, many different sources or many different reasons that explain why some places go faster and some places go slower. But perhaps what I'm more interested in is when people consciously decide to go more slowly. And there are many movements now of, I don't know, slow food, slow thinking all over the world, which is usually associated to the middle classes. But there are also many communities that refuse to go fast, right? Traditional communities, and I'm thinking, for example, of the indigenous communities in Brazil, Peru, or Paraguay that have refused to enter the time of the nation state, and they have escaped to the rainforest, to very isolated areas, so that they can basically live in their slow time, and they have done that purposefully. So, yeah.
Couldn't you argue though that if you have cultural heterogeneity in time, that when you look at people, say these people who are illegal immigrants come to the United States, so they have a slightly different material culture. Remember, it's made of plastic, bottles and things. They're also caught up in the same system, though. Why are they doing that? They're doing it because the system, which has certain people in who are privileged, like us, can travel fast, do all these things, also incorporates them. That's why they're coming to the United States. So there are no real isolated units. I'm not saying USA was saying that. In some degree, material culture might be a little misleading if you don't have the social, cultural element of what they're thinking and doing in regard to the whole system. And another question, by the way, you say the victims of history. Have you excavated mass graves where the Republicans and communists murdered nationalists in Spain, or only the other way around?
Yeah. Okay, the second question is easier. Most of the mass graves with victims, people that were killed by revolutionaries or Republicans, they were exhumed immediately after the war, and they were monumentalized and so on. So there are very, very few mass graves still with remains of victims of the Republican violence. But there are some archaeologists that have excavated them. There are 2 or 3 examples. There is a large mass grave in a mine shaft near Madrid with the remains of about 150 people, including priests and women and so on. And they were excavated a few years ago. So there are, the issue there, the reason there are no more excavations or more exhumations of these victims It is because there is no archaeological record, basically. Yeah. But it's at the same time, it is a pity from a purely scientific point of view, because we are learning a lot about the patterns of violence, of fascist violence, if you want, but we do not have this information for the other side. And regarding the first question, you're totally right. I mean, you cannot, in a sense, we are all part of the same time, which is the time of globalization, but there are just different ways in which we can adjust to this time of globalization, and there are people that resist more this incorporation, or that try to negotiate this incorporation in different ways. And material culture, of course, can be very misleading, because, of course, these immigrants from Central America, they're using industrial clothes and plastic and everything like any of us, right? So if we just read material culture, if we just interpret the material culture CDs, we would be losing a lot of information and a lot of nuances.
If I just add one footnote, then I'll shut up. Spooner left because he's our number expert on globalization. But what they're calling globalization, and I'm a historical archaeologist, it started 500 years ago. But what they're calling globalization is we've learned how to make information flow much faster, much more broadly. But we're not moving people or goods faster or broadly since at least the middle of the 20th century, if not earlier 20th century. We haven't solved that problem. So it's information flow that's involved with globalization more than the movement of actual physical people. Named out of chain. Star Trek.
Yeah, definitely. I totally agree with that. But what is interesting from an archaeological point of view is to see the material effects of these virtual changes, because we tend to forget that we speak too much about the virtual world, that everything is, you know, about communication and the internet and television and so on. But this has real material effects in many places, right? Yes.
It's a very complicated set of factors that you're introducing here, but it is done beautifully, and I really like the way you're going about it. But with each of these conclusions, I would think there's some scope for perhaps a little exploration. The first one is called the time of things, over space. That connection between time and space is very, very important, I feel, when we think of in terms of consequences of action. That's the first thing. The heterotemporality issue, it raises the question, you know, what is it all for? Whether you're going fast or slow, but to what end? Okay. The third one is commitment with the victims of history. There, a issue of ethics comes in. But whose ethics? And that's a problem in philosophy, which is called ethical relativism. We need to address that. But given these issues, there are a couple of points that I'd like to bring from philosophy and economics. First of all, economics. We use cost-benefit analysis as a technique. And all of modernity is very much oriented towards measurement. And how we measure, how those techniques work, what are the limitations of techniques, what is it that they don't do, become very important. So, for instance, cost-benefit analysis. What you've introduced over here is that for whom? That's a very important issue that you introduced. So, in cost-benefit analysis, when we are distinguishing short-term, which is based on perception, from reality, which is long-term, which is complex. So one will also ask, not just for whom, but for at whose cost. At whose cost. And thirdly, who decides? So these are other things that come in. So from philosophy, Aristotle's idea of four causes, that there's what you call material, efficient, formal, and final. They are essentially what is the input, the technology, the output, the satisfaction. Very simply integrated. So from that standpoint, it's a question of to what end, you see. And in an interconnected world, which was being talked about with globalization. We have a very interconnected world. We know, and the information, that is a very, very relevant and valid point. That what do we do with it? When we have, if my happiness depends on yours, and yours on mine, then whose happiness? So that was fine.
I think it's a very relevant question. Yeah, definitely. Who benefits from the acceleration of time, for example, the acceleration of money, who are the beneficiaries of that, and who are the victims? And I think this is an important question because we tend to take for granted that there are things that are simply good, like mobility or change. But I think we have to reflect a little bit more about that from this point of view, from the point of view of who are the beneficiaries, and which are the benefits, if there are any. And this might lead to other kind of epistemological questions or political questions or ethical questions. Thank you. Yeah.
So I've been trying to think about exactly how to formulate this question. You made me think about a lot of things, and in particular to a body of literature that I've been working on sort of and thinking about on an eventful archaeology broadly, and sort of how we think about a single event within these broader time periods that we tend to use in archaeology. And here, I guess my question stems from the idea, do you see, in your thinking about this, sort of a cyclical pattern going on, of slow time and fast time and the time of things working in different ways? And I can try and give just a teeny bit more background. But in particular, I've been really interested in the idea that the moments that often exist between these sort of historiographic slices that you were mentioning tend to be times where time speeds up, where a lot of changes take place at once, and there's sort of a cascade of changes, and then things sort of level out again. I'm curious to just hear you respond a little bit to that and see if you've thought at all about patterns or cycles that take place within these different times that you're talking about, or if you see them as much more random, less sort of cyclical or patterned.
Well, that's a very archaeological question, I would say. Yeah. I think we should pay more attention to that. Because we tend to think in this way when we're dealing with the deep past, when we are thinking about the Paleolithic or the Neolithic, because we see these patterns seem to be, I guess, the more obvious, right? Whereas when we are dealing with the recent period, we leave that to historians. But perhaps we could tell something about that from an archaeological point of view, to look at these notes of change, and to see if there is any pattern behind that. And I have to say that I haven't thought about that, but I think it's really important.
Yeah, I'm a prehistorian, so it's different for me to think in this sense. But I guess where this was coming from was trying to wrap my head around whether those patterns, whether there's different between this era of sort of supermodernity that you're discussing as they were in the past, or if we can think of certain archaeological moments as also being places where things sped up to sort of this, I think you referred to it as hyper-eventful moments. As a prehistorian, I think of many hyper-eventful moments in the past as well, and it's interesting to think about how those compare to this moment that we're looking at.
Well, I think that there is the issue with punctuated evolution, right, where you have these specific moments of time when everything changes really, really fast, and then nothing happens for several millennia, right? So I think it's, thinking comparatively, as archaeologists, I think it is really important if we want to do something relevant also for the recent past. But I'm also suspicious with taking these comparisons too far, because I think that really, it's perhaps not very fashionable to say that, but I think that really the time of supermodernity or high modernity is quite unique in many ways. So I think we have to compare because we have a lot to learn, but understanding the Mesolithic and the temporality of the Mesolithic will not necessarily help us understand the time of the 20th century and the 21st century, because the politics that are behind the acceleration of time and so on are very specific of our period. So it is like, if you want to understand the Anthropocene and human adaptations to the Anthropocene, of course it is good to look at the end of the Pleistocene, but the political context and the political economic context is so different that if you think that you can, in a way, understand better the Anthropocene by looking at the change from the Pleistocene to the Holocene, you're in a way naturalizing the Anthropocene, whereas it is something that is very cultural and very politically specific. But having said that, I think that these comparisons are good from an epistemological point of view, mostly. Yeah. I think that Amber has something to say.
Good afternoon, Amber Henry. Thank you for your talk. In considering your perspectives on heterotemporality, I'm thinking about the ways that indigenous people in particular are sometimes othered by being constructed as outside of place and outside of time. And in that context, you can think of the past as being not only, as you said, an interruption to the present, but as a threat to the present. And I'm wondering, as we're thinking about this idea of heterotemporality, how we can avoid the idea of, in considering different time periods, different moments of time, how we can avoid that the tendency to other people based on their time, especially thinking about the indigenous man and the Amazons that you put up, thinking about how these different times end up constructing also forms of other based on these.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's also an important question. The problem is that traditionally, understanding that others have other temporalities have meant marginalizing these people because they live in a time that is simply wrong. They shouldn't live in that time because that's a primitive time. So you have to improve them, you have to modernize them. So the idea is to neutralize this difference or to romanticize this difference. Right? There is no way you can respect the time of the other. So what I'm proposing here is to respect this time in itself. So there is nothing wrong with people using bows and arrows. There is nothing romantic in that. There is nothing that is morally wrong. And from this point of view, there is nothing morally good in us using cars or machine guns, right? So the problem is that this idea of identifying the time of the other as a specific time is again not very fashionable because it is so much associated to issues of colonialism and racism and so on that it is very difficult to say, okay, let's respect the time of the other. And this othering is not necessarily negative. It is simply that we have to learn to live with real difference. And when I mean real difference, I mean with ontological difference, which is not just the kind of difference that respects multiculturalism.
Thanks for the talk. I wanted to respectfully push back on the conceptual distinctions you made in the first section of the talk and thinking about the difference of the time of things versus the time of historiography. And just to, at least in my way of thinking about it, I have a hard time separating those two things because in my view, texts and the information contained in them are things themselves. And so oftentimes I don't find that distinction to be terribly useful. And I just wondered your thoughts on the materiality of texts and how that may or may not destabilize some of the differences between these different forms of temporality.
Well, on the one hand, it is true that the first who theorized about these more complex temporalities were historians that were working with texts, with books or documents in archives. So it is not necessarily things that really challenge historicists' perspectives of time. So you can do that, and they have been doing that, many historians using documents. So I totally agree that we do not have to create a sharp divide between the kind of history that is being done with documents and with artifacts. It is more the idea of the time of materiality, perhaps, rather than things, in the sense of Jacques Rancière, for example, talks about material regularities rather than things or artifacts in itself, and it is the time of the body, for example, or the time of landscape, or things like that, that are not so specific, that are not so associated to specific things or objects, right? And you can do that using any kind of evidence, oral testimonies, or documents, or whatever. And the second thing, the idea that texts are objects in themselves. That's something that can be, of course, explored archaeologically. Right? What does it mean, the fact that people stopped using tablets in the Middle East at some point and started using parchment or papyri or things like that? What does it mean beyond the mere technological fact? What does it mean from a political point of view, for example? And what kind of temporalities or periodizations can we do can we propose by following the time of the materiality of texts? That could be really interesting.
Thank you. You presupposed the point that I was going for, the difference between tablets or codices or what have you.
Yeah.
So thank you again for this brilliant talk. I'm fascinated by your goal to do an archaeology of the urgent, the ethical, and the relevant. How do you figure out your sites? Obviously, the massacre site is a no-brainer. You can't go wrong with the massacre site in some sense. But there's also lots of other sort of competitive sites in terms of what's urgent, how to decide what's urgent, and how to decide what's ethical. I was thinking back, it's in terms of like your critique of the of our fixation on the destroyed factory versus the boring vernacular architecture. But then at the same time, perhaps the urgency there for someone living in the inner city, who's facing chronic incarceration for the rest of their lives, it's precisely the highlighting of the crushed factory that starts to get at how they're a victim of hyper-incarceration or something like that. So I'm just curious, obviously in some sense it's thinking out loud, what are other sites that you've seen that are high stakes and worthwhile in your career?
I would say that almost everything. The fact is that I have almost no experience digging mass graves. I'm not a physical anthropologist myself, so I hire anthropologists to do the exhumations, and I have done that like 2 or 3 times compared to my colleagues in Spain who have dug like dozens of mass graves. And what I have done is mostly looking at all the kinds of evidence that are not so hot, if I can say that. And it is difficult because I think that there are pressing ethical issues behind these sites, like concentration camps, social housing of the time of the dictatorship, refugee camps, things like that. But the problem is that to make your point is really difficult when the public is accustomed to see mass graves and to see the excavation of mass graves and all the terrible stories that you can find in a mass grave of specific individuals being tortured or killed and so on. So when you are talking about a hospital from the 1940s or a prison or a project of social housing, it is really very difficult to attract the attention of people and tell them this is important and you have to take this into account because this is really determining your life, probably more than the mass grave because you're still living in a totalitarian environment. So I think that there are many, many things that are important from an ethical point of view and that are sometimes overlooked.
Just to follow up on that though, but if you're thinking about this commitment to the victims of history that you talk about, and when you talk about the time of things, and in some sense creating a democratic view of the past, and I think you use those words. Of course, I think we're all aware of the fact that in fact even material culture of the past is controlled about what sites are chosen, what sites are excavated, how that is excavated, to the point where alternative histories of the past, alternative models of what went on in the past get created. So that even as we were answering Bob Schuyler, even the nature of which mass graves were excavated in the past and memorialized in contrast to the ones that were not excavated, this is an ongoing process. And so I'm not sure, I'm wondering really how archaeology, except done by, and excuse the expression, good people who are looking for democratic answers, can produce anything other than what they are looking for in the end. I mean, I agree with you because, in fact, I think you are a good person looking for democratic answers. I hope you are. And I hope that I am also. But in fact, not all the people who might be arguing this would be doing the same thing, as we know in the past. And in fact, the ability to deal with text and rewrite the past is not that much different than the ability to deal with material culture and material in the ground and rewrite that past and have a very different answer to what happened in the past. So how do you deal with that? I mean, the argument that you make I agree with, but I'm not sure everyone would.
Yeah, that's a very good question, and a difficult one. My take on this is that in the case of Spain, that is the same thing if you go to Second World War archaeology and the study of the Nazi genocide, is that people usually do the archaeology of the good guys, right? They want to recover the voices of the victims of history, and I try to do that too. But what I try to do too is to look at the other side. And in the case of a civil war, this is easier because the atrocities being committed by both sides. So I'm studying also the technologies of repression that were used by the Republic or by revolutionaries. So in a sense, you have to explore the dark side. And this, on the one hand, you have to do it from a purely scientific point of view, because you cannot have just half of the picture, right? You have to understand everything. But also because it's sort of an ethical challenge to face the brutality of the people you, I guess you feel you associate with in a way, right? I think this is. The thing is that this is important. You have to do that from scientific reasons and also for ethical reasons. You have to face this dark side all the time. But the problem is how you publicize this, how you talk to the public about that. Because we are very active in the internet and have several web pages, and we publicize our work in different ways. The problem is that when we try to talk about the other violences, the dark side, and when we try to make the narrative a little bit more complicated and not just the good people and the bad people, then there are many problems like revisionist historians and neo-Nazis and so on using our words to support their cause and things like that. So it is really difficult to do that. So there are many other ethical problems that arise from that. Even when you want to say, well, I know, I'm going to be beyond good and evil, and I'm going to produce a narrative that is really objective, that takes everything into account. The problem is how do you manifest that? How do you talk about that in public? And it's not easy. I mean, I can do this here, this is not a problem, but if I do that in a village in Spain, that will not work.
We have come to our time, unfortunately, but if you have questions left, I'm sure Dr. Gonzalez would be happy to answer them. If we can just thank him one more time for yeah, for the moment, but Kyle may
Okay, so we're going to meet.